Okay, everybody, you ready? I'm ready. This is our last video on markets, and this is where we get to put everything together. And I think it's exciting because this is a model that's going to be with us for the rest of the course. And we'll see how we use it and why. This is where, for the first time, boiling down our thinking in this strange way to only think about two dimensions at once is going to allow us to make predictions and see whether those predictions correspond to how we saw things play out in the real world. So here we go. We'll talk about equilibrium, what we mean by that, why it exists, and think about what are the consequences when things move, when things shift, what happens to price and quantity. Okay, so equilibrium is going to be where the market, quote unquote, clears. The quantity demanded is equal to the quantity supplied. So we're still thinking about masks in Maine, the price. We've got our supply curve, which we know slopes up, and our demand curve, which we know slopes down. And there's going to be a place where those two cross, and that is our equilibrium. We're going to label it with these stars. We'll talk about in chapter 5 why this is the most efficient place. What are things that we like about it and things that we don't necessarily appreciate? But for now, we're going to allow that to be where we end up. So this magic special place, why? Why not here? Why not here? Why not here? Why not here? Why not over here? Why do we end up there? Why do the market forces push us to that place over and over again? I've heard of the invisible hand of the market. It's bringing us there. So I want you just to pause for a second and reflect, write down an answer in the quiz. Why do you think that we're going to predict that's the only stable outcome from the market? Why does this feel inevitable where supply and demand cross? I just want to get your raw thoughts before you see me walk you through my rationale. I want to hear what you think. So just pause and respond to that question. Why P star Q star? Why is that the only stable outcome? Okay. I think there's a lot of ways we can think about this. Economists tend to range from like philosopher to pragmatist. And I am way over here in the pragmatist camp. So I'm sorry to those of you who are like deeply interested in economics and philosophy. I will tell you that's just not where the field has been moving recently. The field has been moving much more towards empirics and data. And what does the data say? So for me, the best way to explain why is to say the counterfactual, because everything else is unstable. Well, the why not? So I've been exposed to this in lots of different ways. I'll tell you, my principles of micro professor in college, he had an interesting take on it. He told us that the reason why we always end up at equilibrium is the invisible hand is the hand of God, and it pushes us there. And so I'm not willing to say that. So I'm just gonna like get into the nitty gritty of why we can't be anywhere else. The counterfactual is the most compelling story to me. So for me, it's because any other price, we're gonna have a surplus or a shortage. So the market forces are always pushing us back to P star. So I like to tangibly see the invisible hand by thinking about what happens if we're at another place. So I will walk you through what happens when price is too low, and I'm going to ask you to walk through the other possibility when the price is too high on your problem set. So if we're in the masks market, we've got our price and quantity labeled, we've got our supply and our demand, and this is where P star Q star would be. We're not going to like jump into that equilibrium. A lot of times we'll be out of equilibrium. And what that would look like if the price was too low, any price below P star, further down on the x-axis. Let's say, sometimes it helps some of us to have some more tangible prices on here. Let's say the equilibrium price of masks, I don't know, I feel like it depends on the mask, but for like a nice cloth face mask, I feel like I've been paying like $10 to $15. So let's say $15 is the equilibrium price. So if the price is too low, and it's only $8, what will happen? Well, supply and demand curve want to be your friends. Their job, if you plug in a price, they will spit out on the quantity axis the quantity supplied for the supply curve. And the quantity supplied is going to be really low. Let's say if the equilibrium price or quantity of masks in Maine is, let's do this in per person terms, because that is more tangible to me. So the equilibrium quantity is for everyone to have 3 masks at a price of $8. Suppliers will only be willing to produce 1.5 masks per person. That looks roughly to scale to me, right? They are rational, so if the price is lower, they're going to produce less. There's not very many masks on the market at a price that's too low. Meanwhile, the demand curve is telling us at that low price of $8, consumers are stoked, right? They are cheap, they are thrifty, they love cheap masks. The quantity demanded will be very high, maybe something like 5.5 masks per person. And what we end up with when the quantity demanded outweighs the quantity supplied is called a shortage. What this looks like in the real world is you go to Target or Hannaford or Walmart and there are no masks on the shelf. You go to Amazon and try and buy them and they say there will be a 2-week delay in shipping, we'll let you know and charge you when the product ships, right? You go to the mask ad that pops up in your Instagram feed and you click on it and the seller lets you know, hey, we're not sure when these are going to ship. There's a shortage of masks. The demand outstrips the supply. And who has the power in that situation? Supplier. When there's a shortage, when people are lining up and the goods are not on the shelf, there's pressure on the price to rise, right? If you are in a shortage situation, you say, hey, come on, I know $8 isn't worth your time, but like, just give me the last one you have left and I'll pay you 10, I'll pay you 12. But you're bribing people to get them to give you the good because the good is not available at the price that the market is set, right? So I think there's a lot of assumptions that make this kind of hard to see in real life, but remember, we're assuming all these masks are exactly the same. Everybody knows the price and quality. All of our assumptions are still there in the background. If there's a shortage, the price will start to rise. And as the price inches up, the shortage gets less bad, less bad, less bad, less bad, boom. This is where people stop bribing suppliers to give them masks. This is where the bartering stops. This is where the market is stable. Everybody that wants a mask at $15 can find one. There's no shortage of product. There's no surplus of product. So that arrow right there is the invisible hand. Like people bargaining up the price when the quantities aren't right, when the quantities are not equal, is the market forces. Hopefully that makes sense to all of you. Maybe think about a time when you've seen bargaining play out in the real world. What does it feel like? What's a situation where you've seen a shortage? For me, a lot of times it looks like somebody buys up all of the product I want and starts relisting it on eBay for higher prices, right? And then you really see the auction make the price rise. Okay, so that's what happens if the price is too low. And if we're at this $15 price, that's a stable place. So you can think of that as like a black hole. That sounds bad. I said glory hole one time, but I do know what that means. But it's like all the forces are pushing us to this place. You know, like the Interstellar black hole, if you've seen that movie, it's like not necessarily a bad thing. But if we're anywhere else on the graph, there's going to be pressure for us to move to this intersection of supply and demand. Okay. So now what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the consequences of shifts. This is the way we're going to use the model about 90% of the time. And students always want to know, like, how should I do these? What are the steps? So if you're somebody who's kind of struggling with thinking in terms of this graph, this is a really reliable way to make sure you're not kind of missing something. So I'm going to draw the initial equilibrium, label everything, say which curve did this event affect? Was it a movement in the curve or a shift, an actual shift? Which direction? Label our new equilibrium and talk about price and quantity and how they're affected. So I think this is best demonstrated through an example. So for example, let's think about the home trampoline market and COVID-19. I'll tell you, I've been in the market for a trampoline since about April when it got warm enough because my 4-year-old, that was one of the only safe ways for him to get his energy out. All of the playgrounds around here were closed. So I've been looking for one for a long time. I can tell you prices have been very high and there haven't been very many available. So why is that? Let's warp our common sense into our model, okay? So the first step is to draw the initial equilibrium with all our labels. So, oops, we're thinking about trampolines. And we're thinking about price and quantity space. We've got our supply, our demand. This is the initial equilibrium. You can label it however you want. I would usually do something like Q0 so that you know that's where we started. Or you could label this P star, Q star, like we were. And then when things shift, you can use like prime notation or label it P1, Q1, however you want to communicate to me that this is where I started and after the event, this is where I'll end up, okay? So we drew our initial equilibrium with labels. Which curve does COVID-19 affect? So this is where you kind of want to have in your head a chart of all the things that will shift demand and supply. So for demand, remember it's like income, tastes and preferences, the price of substitutes and price of complements affects both of them, the number of buyers, the number of sellers, tax and subsidy, and then expectations. I know this is messy. And then for supply, instead of income, it's inputs, and instead of tastes and preferences, it's technology. So I think COVID-19 actually did two things to the home trampoline market. I think the first thing that it did, label in blue, was change people's tastes and preferences. Could also argue that it changed people's incomes, right? Because we know a lot of people are unemployed now and can't afford trampolines. So you can choose to model as many as you want. You're always going to be graded on your economic reasoning and the completeness, the effort that went into your answer. So I think this would be a great answer, but I think there are other ways to answer this. So I think that it affected demand through tastes and preferences. Now, all of a sudden, when playgrounds are closed, you want something else for your kids to get their energy out. Is this a movement or a shift? So this is where you want to have alarm bells go off. It's like, if it told you that there was like a COVID-19 sale on trampolines, you'd be like, that is not a shift. That is a movement along the existing demand curve. I'm not going to move anything around. But the question doesn't say that. So if we think it's affecting the model through tastes, then that is a shift. Which direction? I think it made demand go up. So now I'm ready to draw a new demand curve. And this is what we call prime notation, so like giving it a little asterisk. And if that were the only thing that happened, we would now be here, where there are more trampolines being sold and they're selling for higher prices. But that's not the only thing that happened because of COVID-19, right? I can tell you that we actually ended up at a place where the quantity was affected negatively as well. So what do you think is driving that? Many markets, not just trampolines, looked like this. Now all of a sudden people wanted many more of them, but suppliers were simultaneously affected. So I think the other thing that happened is inputs became less available or more expensive. So now if you're a trampoline manufacturer, when the virus, especially at the very beginning of the pandemic, you might have actually physically been shut down by the local regulations in your factory. you might have been shut down by the ability to import and export product. Regardless, it became much more expensive to produce trampolines safely, right? You have to install all of this equipment in your factory to ensure that workers are able to social distance and have good airflow and not become kind of an epicenter for the pandemic. So all of those things shifted the supply curve. So supply, shift, which direction? Down, meaning to the left. Right? At every price, they're now able to supply less trampolines. So that means, depending on which shift we think was larger, which we know nothing about, right? We don't have formulas for these curves. We're not trying to quantify their impact in terms of size. Whether the blue shift in demand or the red shift in supply was larger will dictate what happens on the quantity axis. But here's our new equilibrium. We're at our new demand curve and our new supply curves. We're at the red equilibrium, not the blue one. So the new quantity is actually what we're going to call ambiguous. Demand went up, but supply went down. So we're not sure what will happen to quantity. Depends on the magnitude of the shifts. And from personal experience that the supply shift overwhelmed the demand shift for the time being because there were less trampolines available. They were completely out of stock. But a lot of that could have just been a shortage, that it took time for us to jump into the new equilibrium, right? If you think about on the existing supply curve with that new price in blue, there would have been a shortage right here if supply hadn't fallen at the same time also, where the quantity supplied and the quantity demanded were not in sync. It's going to take time for the supply to move up to that higher point. So, but where are we? Sorry for the sidebar. The new equilibrium in red leads to much higher prices for trampolines. That's not ambiguous. Both of the shifts are pushing prices up. So we know, how did price and quantity change? Price went up, quantity we're not sure, right? Oops. Hopefully that makes sense to you all. And I think the best way to check that is to do an example of your own. So here, I want you to read through this, and then you're gonna draw it on paper and then pause and take the multiple choice quiz. So this is from the exam last year. Consider the market for birth control pills, a market that I feel strongly you should understand whether you're a consumer or not. And two things happen at the same time. The US trade relationship with China changes, so there's increased costs of manufacturing birth control abroad. And the composition of the Supreme Court makes some US consumers expect birth control to become more expensive and difficult to obtain. So show me the impact of these two shifts and tell me which curve shifted and why, and then pause and take the multiple choice quiz. It's always easier to do this part on paper, but I think the quiz will help you check whether you got it right. Okay, so hopefully you're done with that part and we can talk about the answer in class. I would also love to hear from you. What's a market that you want to think about in class together this week? So I've shown you some things about masks, trampolines, made you think about birth control. Tell me a market that you would love to see. This is one of the things that's harder about doing things asynchronously is trying to figure out what you all find interesting. So I've done lots of different things. I've done heroin and chocolate and Yeezys, and usually we'd be in class together and you'd be voting about that real time. I want you to tell me a couple markets, one or more, as many markets as you think would be really interesting to see. My threat is always, if you don't tell me a market, we will do salmon or I don't know, I used to say diapers, but I'm not really a consumer of diapers anymore. We'll probably just do salmon if you don't pick a market, because that's the market I think about the most as being a fisheries economist who studies salmon. So pause, tell me what markets you think would be interesting, and then you're out of here. Thanks all.